You might remember we've spoken before about the government's counter-extremism bill on the News Hour. It's been planning to get churches and Christian groups which teach kids for more than 6 hours a week to register with Ofsted so they can be inspected. The proposals were met with vociferous opposition from believers who saw it as a form of state monitoring of their churches and feared they could be punished for having traditional views on things like marriage. Well, according to a Whitehall source speaking to The Observer at the weekend, those plans are apparently sinking without a trace. We understand lawyers are concerned the government's definition of extremism is too vague and the bill could end up being illegal, so they might be shelving it. Well, joining me on the line now is Simon Calvert, the Deputy Director for Public Affairs at the Christian Institute. Good afternoon, Simon.
Good afternoon.
The government reaffirmed just a few weeks ago, Simon, its commitment to regulating out-of-hours school settings. Your reaction to this news now?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic about it. I think we have to keep the issue of out-of-school settings separate in our minds from the counter-extremism bill. We've all heard rumours that the counter-extremism bill might be being delayed, and that's because it requires a definition of extremism. And, the government's various attempts to define that concept of extremism range between the ridiculous and the hilarious. But that is their problem. They can't define extremism in legislation without cutting across freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. But out-of-school settings regulation doesn't require a definition of extremism, so they can legislate for that separately. And only a week and a half ago, we had Lord Nash, the Education Minister, in the House of Lords, telling the House that, well, yes, they know they've got to tread carefully, but that they intend to go ahead with something on out-of-school settings. So I think that we must assume that the government is going to propose something on out-of-school settings, and we must be ready for that when it comes.
So could there be a more covert way of regulating things like Sunday schools coming in then?
Well, I mean, Lord Nash was quite clear in the House of Lords that they are already tackling places where, for example, children are not being kept safe, where there are safeguarding issues. So all that says to me is that where there really are genuine problems, they already have the legislative and practical powers to deal with them. What they've never been able to convince anyone is that the registering every organisation that does more than 6 hours youth work is the solution to terrorism, because most people just regard those two things as unconnected. The idea of regulating out-of-school settings, that was Nicky Morgan's idea. She's no longer the Education Secretary, and it was one of her more controversial proposals. And of course, it came out at the same time as she was pushing Ofsted to go in hard on Christian schools, and frankly, Ofsted's hostility to some Christian schools has really destroyed the trust that many Christians have in it. And that's one of the reasons why I was so concerned about the idea of giving Ofsted a role in churches. So I think that there are other powers that government can use where there are genuine problems, like health and safety issues. But I think that if the government wants to go ahead with some kind of registration and inspection system, it could do that without the need for a counter-extremism bill. So we have to be on the alert. And if I may, I'd encourage people to follow the Christian Institute's Facebook page for updates on that.
Simon, you mentioned the word trust there. Can we trust the government to decide what is and isn't extremism? Can we trust the government to regulate well, inverted commas, efficiently, inverted commas? Can we trust them?
Well, I mean, the short answer is no. You asked exactly the right question. So, to the broad issue of whether the government can legislate for extremism, they've done a great deal to undermine confidence that they can ever get that right. I mean, we have an integration czar in the form of Louise Casey, who appeared before the Communities Committee a couple of weeks ago, and said, compared the kind of extremism which they apparently found in some Birmingham Trojan horse schools, she compared that to Roman Catholic schools who don't support gay marriage. That's outrageous. But that's where the integration czar is at. And she also said the phrase, "I have a problem with the expression of religious conservatism." Well, I mean, she would think that the Christian Institute and Premier and most of your listeners would qualify as religious conservatives. So she, the integration czar, has a problem with us expressing our Christian beliefs. That's quite serious. So no, I don't think we can trust them. But let me say, it's not just Christians that are worried about that. Christian Institute is working in alliance with the National Secular Society, the Peter Tatchell Foundation, with Big Brother Watch, English Pen, all kinds of organisations who are coming from very different sort of philosophical positions from us, but they all share an anxiety that if you give a government, any government, the power to define what's apparently extremism, then you could wind up taking away civil liberties from a lot of people. And who those people are, the people who are targeted, could change depending on which party is in government.
OK, Simon, we'll leave it there. Simon Calvert from the Christian Institute. Thank you for joining me on the News Hour today. It's really appreciated, Simon.